Okay, hello. It's March 6th, 2020. This is George Webb on the Diplomatic Back Channel. A little bit wet outside today, so we're inside. But the big news of the day is Crowdstrike. Crowdstrike has recanted that they ever said it was the Russians in the Russia hoax. So this is a big development. Gateway Pundit's out with the story saying, now Crowdstrike is saying, hey, we didn't know that it was Russians. We just said that we thought it was Russians. We told you this was the case, and we said the defense was going to be an affirmative defense by proving who it really was and outing who it really was would get Crowdstrike to do the recanting, and today they did. If you remember back, I republished the videos earlier today, but I talked about a general, and his name is Roth, and it sounds a lot like children. But if you didn't have a whole lot of children and just had one child, it sounds like if you put those two words together. I think it's actually a fake name in the IDF because there's so much Rothschild conspiracy theory out on the internet. I hate even saying the word. But in this case, this is a true general, a true Israeli Defense Force general. Again, I wanted my kids to serve in the IDF, both of them, so I'm not being Israel bashing here. But he kind of came up through the ranks in the intelligence services, and he's based in Arizona. Now, if you remember you may remember I did a video about NetACS, about PetroQuest and his company's elite communication services and all these different types of encrypted communication to satellites, encrypted communication in a group of intel operatives, that sort of thing. But if you don't remember that, you can go to my Patreon. You can see 2 years ago we were talking about this. But so let's get back to General Rothschild. He came up through the ranks in the IDF, and where he really made his mark, if you will, was in the pacification of Palestine. I'm not a greater Israel person. I do believe Israel has a right to exist, etc. And I don't want this to go down the Israel rat hole just because the person who runs the group who ran these Russians just happens to be Israeli. But if you remember in the indictment of the GRU people, remember Rod Rosenstein comes out in a very dramatic way as President Trump's meeting the Queen, and he indicts the Russians, quote unquote, Russians, GRU operatives, officers, he calls them. And in actual fact, nothing could have been further from the truth. Now that they had served in the GRU at one time, and some of them still may have been active duty, but certainly not acting on the behest of Russia or Putin. But we'll get back to that. Let's go back and lay a foundation with what actually Rod Rosenstein said in the indictment. He named two sets of 12 people, if you remember. There was a group of GRU agents that were sort of stealing information, and then there was another group that were analyzing the information and disseminating the information, trolls, etc. Okay, those are the two GRU groups that he talked about. And he talked about an unnamed Arizona company. And he talked about how the data went from Washington, D.C., where the servers were, the DNC, and then went out through a server in an unnamed company. Again, remember, this has to be military-grade encryption. So Danny Rothschild's looking pretty good here as running the encrypted communication services for IDF. And then it ran out to overseas to the Russians. Well, if you look and see actually what server it ran through, and Rod Rosenstein protected the name of NetACS. There's two other firms involved with this. As I mentioned earlier, Elite Communication Service is the satellite encryption that Danny runs. And the main thing that Danny Rothschild is doing in Arizona is doing oil exploration and gas exploration using satellite data. Again, you can see, just much like this fireplace, creates little disturbances in the atmosphere and so forth. You can look at the Earth's atmosphere at places where they call seepage points. And in these seepage points, this is when the Earth cooled 4.5 billion years ago or whatever, however many years it was. There's a seepage point there, just as the same way when a fire burns, it doesn't go out uniformly. And that's where you can look at places for trace elements. And then if you can disturb the Earth, either through an underground nuclear test or an underground explosive, et cetera, you can cause gases and so forth to emerge, much like the gases coming out of this fireplace, to find oil and gas. And their company they had was called PetroQuest. And it was based in Lafayette, Louisiana. This is where two of our GRU, the main two GRU spies in Rod Rosenstein's indictment, come into the United States. Remember, they come into Joe Louis Airport into Louisiana. They come up to Lafayette. They cause a toxic cloud hoax in Lafayette, Louisiana at a carbon black firm. Again, this is industrial espionage. Carbon black is used in motorcycle helmets and for various industrial uses, but one of the great uses it has is stealth, for stealth coatings for submarines, stealth coatings for airplanes, missiles, you name it, helicopters, etc. And if you can cause an EPA type of event at one of these places, then you can go in and buy it for pennies on the dollar. And that's what Danny Rothschild really does. DNC hacking is not really what Danny Rothschild does. He's more the economic type hacker. Now he has these groups of 12 in Israel. They're called Kidons, K-I-D-O-N. So that's why I made a little bit of a pun there. Roth children. These are General Roth and his children, or kids, or Kidons. And they're usually in groups of 12. And it's a very extensive 2-year training program in Mossad to get to be on these Kidons. You make one mistake on a Kidon, you're gone for good. There's no mistakes allowed on these things. And it's for economic spying and so forth. And again, big supporter of Israel, not a greater Zionist, greater Israel person, but I do believe Israel has a right to exist. I don't want to go down the Israel rat hole. I'm just following where the evidence actually leads. Now, if you look at PetroQuest, this goes back to 2009, most of their activity was offshore, as we've talked about. Remember Louisiana offshore pipeline, and you may remember that there was these Gulf leases, Gulf of Mexico leases. You may remember Fast and Furious to create renationalize Pemex. You don't need to worry all about that now. You just need to know the reason why Crowdstrike recanted today about saying maybe it wasn't the Russians, maybe it was just people who had Russian-sounding names, is because we identified the people who actually were on the list instead of Rod Rosenstein glossing them over. Remember, Rod Rosenstein never puts out pictures we put out pictures of people who reuse postage stamps, but he never puts out pictures of supposedly the people who hacked the DNC for any of the 12. And of course, we found their pictures and we found their backgrounds. We saw them working all over the United States in places like California, looking at the Naval Strategic Petroleum Reserve there. They seem to be working in the Gulf of Mexico near the Navy's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, gigantic petroleum reserve in the Gulf. This PetroQuest also seemed to be closely affiliated with the Wagner Group. Again, this is the group of 12 trolls that Prigozhin, Putin's chef, has for taking territory and taking places like Venezuela, like other places where they've introduced destabilization means and methods. You're going to find this pattern recurring over and over and over again. Now, why am I coming out now and repeating it, Stanley Rothschild? Well, up until today, we had Crowdstrike being sort of bullheaded and saying, no, it was the Russians. It was the Russians. Today, they're recanting, and the reason why they're recanting is because they don't want to endanger their missile business. And I'll explain what I mean. Hacking is a sidelight to Danny Rothschild and a sidelight to Dmitry Alperovich and CrowdStrike. The real business is in the codes, the launch codes for missiles. Now, again, there's a lot of great presentations out there about Ukraine. Glenn Beck did a series of 3 presentations. What we're going to be doing here in about 2 weeks is going to bring a whole bunch of top experts on the Ukraine topic here. We're going to add the layers of information we know. For instance, the Struck shift connections with all the Russian intermediaries that were selling these missiles, the Club K missiles. We're going to lay that over what Glenn Beck has done. So we're going to take it to the next level So that's gonna be what's coming. We'll explain and lay all this out. For today, though, it's just the news headline. This is the answer to the test. And we just had to wait, basically, for CrowdStrike to realize, oh my gosh, we're gonna have egg on our face if we don't somehow back away from saying it was Russia, Russia, Russia. You're gonna find Paul Whelan was the guy who recruited these people, ex-GRU folks that were in the intelligence agencies, along with just a couple of longtime GRU operatives, Krylova and Bogacheva, living in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And we'll get to all those things. If you don't remember the story and us doing the deep dives and all these folks, not important right now. The big news here is just connecting your dots, connecting the dots that you have in your mind. Hey, there was a server in Arizona that the Russians were communicating to. What server was that? It would have had to have been encrypted if these were military grade or these people had military grade encryption backgrounds. It would have had to be somebody like Danny Rothschild. Well, we don't have to guess. It is NetACS. It is PetroQuest is the other company. It is based in Lafayette, Louisiana. And Elite Communication Services, the people who provide the encrypted communications, both for the terrestrial networks as well as the satellites, that's Elite Communication Services. So again, 2 years ago, we're not gonna be wrong, and much more credible today now because this CrowdStrike is backing away from Russia, Russia, Russia. So I mentioned we're going to be working on sort of Glenn Beck. He called it the final presentation. We're going to do Glenn Beck probably +1, final +1, final +2, final +3. You'll see all this laid out with all the evidence. You'll see Strzok and Schiff and Fruman, Parnas, Okan, Wyansky, how they all created a network. Huma Abedin was the one at Teneo giving out the blackberries. Derek Harvey at Afghan Center of Excellence with his IP addresses, how that moved between 3 different places in the United States as far as IP addresses. So we'll have that proof. We have an IP layer, but then we also have a human domain layer, which is all these people, when you see them together, when you see Faruqi, for instance, the guy who shipped Afghanistan war goods through Iran and through UAE, and you see him standing right next to him, being a longtime DNC person donating to Huma Abedin, you could say, well, I could see him getting an encrypted BlackBerry, yeah. If he was doing an illegal thing about caching weapons somewhere and doing illegal shipments to Iran to get them key infrastructure for their nuclear program, they just give him a Teneo BlackBerry. That's easy. They're sitting right there. So that's human domain analysis. So we're going to be analyzing things in the human domain. That's one layer that we can put over the Glenn Beck type analysis. Glenn Beck really has done a good job of rolling up all the current reporting, so the current open source information. We add the IP addresses, the IP layer. We'll take you to where the missiles are tested and developed. That's Redstone Arsenal. We have those IP addresses. We'll take you to MacDill Air Force Base. We'll take you to Fort Huachuca, the drone development base and missile testing range at White Sands. And we'll take you to Fort Belvoir, which is INSCOM. So we'll develop out these layers and these maps for you over the next couple of days during this get-together that we're going to be having. We also plan to do some length of documentary. I've tried to do a 5-part series, about 5 to 6 minute videos each, with an alphabetical type format, just basically taking you through this whole story, breaking it up sort of in a children's school book fashion. A for Awan's, B for Biden, C for CrowdStrike. There's CrowdStrike. D for DNC, how they were backdooring the money in, rinsing it through DNC. E for energy, there's Danny Rothschild with PetroQuest. F and so forth, going through G for Gaunter, the guy configuring the BlackBerries, H for Hunter Biden, and I for Iran is next. But what people want, I think, is they don't want to do too many of those chapters. They want one 40-minute, 45-minute documentary that starts from the beginning and goes to the end. I'm not sure I can do it even in 2 hours, but 2 hours would certainly be the outside of how long the documentary would be. And just a couple of other things, pickup. So this idea also that we need to make it so that other journalists can pick up the information and then run with it, add value to it, add reporting to it, go to their sources at FBI, CIA, et cetera, DIA, ODNI, et cetera, and add value. So we're going to try to make it as open source as possible with the references and so forth to really push the reporting forward. Again, I pushed out 12 videos yesterday that provide a lot of this background. You're going to see a lot of the hacking tools coming from a guy named Harold Martin at NSA. You're going to see how those hacking tools got placed in some cases in the hands of these GRU Russians. Again, remember, Peter Strzok's background is cyber hacking, the cyber hacking unit, along with his father, Dmitry, along with his father, Mikhail, going back with Peter Strzok 20 years, going back to Deutsch and all those guys that ran FBI, and Louis Freeh and so forth. So we'll add the human dimension later. We'll add the IP dimension. We'll add some more information that we've had that we've reported on already that's open source, that's not incorporated into the Glenn Beck kind of diagram layout to provide a better explanation so you can understand it. But for today, the big news is CrowdStrike recants Russia, Russia, Russia. They didn't say Ukraine, 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 or they didn't say Ukraine, Chechnya, Estonia, and all the other places that they salt away these different operatives after they get out of the military services in Russia or the old Russian, former Russian states. But that's the next step. That's what we want to get Dmitry to go. Remember, this had to be a special access program. In order for this encryption to work in a small conclave, in an enclave, in a secure enclave, an encrypted enclave, they had to take something that was a legitimate enclave and repurpose it for something illegal. So it had to have something like a fast and furious beginning, or nuclear, which is, I believe, another potential enclave for shipping nuclear materials. You could, for instance, use that for shipping weapons or shipping drugs, repurposing transportation as special access programs, or anti-terrorism, which is, we're really honing in now on Norfolk, Virginia, and Operation Anaconda, which is Task Force Orange, going all the way back to 2002 in Afghanistan, and looking at all the money that was put. Now again, this is Cofer Black, this is Blackwater, this is Eric Prince, this is all your Blackwater favorites, and then they bring in poor Hunter Biden at the end in 2013 to hold the bag for the Iran nuclear deal. But they've been using this over and over, all the way through Project Blackjack, which is developing. What are we trying to do? If you're a general or you're an admiral, if you do the Iran deal and watch it happen, you get $0. You know, Iran gets the $150 billion. But if you're smart, you can say, hey, wait a minute. We can carve out a joint venture with these Russian partners. We can bring Russia into this deal, say they need to be part of the negotiations. It won't be 5 nations negotiating this, it'll be 5 plus 1. That was the name of the talks, if you remember, the JCPOA talks were 5 plus 1. Why do we want to bring Russia in? Because we can then say part of the Iran deal will be about nuclear materials, but also it'll be mostly about weapons. We can negotiate, we can give intellectual property to different Russian contractors, KAMAZ trucks for missile trailers and so forth, tanks, anti-aircraft systems and so forth. Remember, Oleg Deripaska and Tolyatti is where those are made, Paul Whelan, small town on the Volga River. We can do different relationships with rocket manufacturers like Energomash, that's again with Leidos. That's again, Paul Whelan. We can do those kind of things for missiles. We can also work with Rosbaron Export, another joint venture. And we can come up with a market basket of about $100 billion worth of stuff that Soleimani in Iran really, really wants. And then we get $50 billion out of the deal, rather than nothing out of the deal. That's the same idea as having Imran Awan on Capitol Hill and making all these Pakistani folks small business executives, and for GSA, to bid on GSA. Remember, they're at the house of somebody who runs GSA, which is Zoe Freitag, right? So, and then we just set aside that you bring your translator back from Iraq. I met General Dunford's translator in Iraq. You get 50 a year you can bring back. And I can bring back General Mattis. put them in a company, and then basically we know what we're buying from Lockheed or Northrop Grumman or whoever. We create a set-aside business for 15% of that business. All the metadata is focusing in now on Norfolk, Virginia, this small company. It's not small, it's actually a very large company that is called Cruz and Associates. They are the ones that sell missiles for the largest surface missile ships that we have. There may be somebody on the USS Monongahela out there from Norfolk that I'd like to recognize their service for their Tomahawk missile service in the Gulf War and Kosovo. And this is the idea, is that you basically structure a deal where you can say, you're not getting the money unless we are in for half. Basically, that's the idea. We won't take it any further than that. Okay, so the deliverable from Team Webb, or Team W, if you will, is going to be adding this IP layer, we're going to be adding a lot more than that in terms of machine-generated information. The machine domain, if you will, the IP address, the technology domain, the SIGINT domain, if you will, or mass-int, as sometimes they call it, the human domain, all the human connections that we've made between different people. Remember, every time when you're doing a social graph, every time you're in a company together, every time you found a business together, every time you have a bank account together, every time you send money to each other, it shows a relationship. We can be able to map that. It's called a sociogram. And we're going to be able to use the same tools that these folks are using, like Palantir, to graph for terrorists, and we're going to graph their network because their pay-to-play network needs to be graphed. So it is all about this double dip, or whatever you want to call it, side business for themselves, pay to play, and we're going to graph that out. That's the deliverable that's coming your way. So I want to say thanks, everyone, for all the incredible research. Remember, there's 12 videos out there yesterday. There's another 3 or 4 out there today that really do deep dives on this, and they're 1 or 2 minute just info solid packages of info that just show you, again, citation after citation, article after article. You can see the source material. You don't even have to look at the comments. You can see the information that puts together the information packets and establishes the connection. And I put one up there about Danny Rothschild again for people who forgot about him today. Thanks, everyone.